Great. Okay, welcome everyone to this IES webinar, Getting Wilder About Carbon for a Real Green Recovery. This webinar is part of a new series of webinars we'll be holding exploring nature-based solutions and the fundamental role they play in meeting climate ambitions, restoring ecosystems, and protecting biodiversity. This webinar series is part of our activities and the third theme on our stages on the road to COP26, which is adaptation. Today, we are delighted to be joined by Evan Bowen-Jones, Chief Executive of the Kent Wildlife Trust. Evan has a background that encompasses implementation of species and landscape-level conservation projects, analysis of international policy, and has been working with NGOs, governments, and corporates to deliver real gains for wildlife all over the world. In this webinar, Evan will be discussing Wilder Carbon, the emerging standard by which locally delivered carbon removal projects can restore nature across the UK. As always, there will be the chance for questions at the end of this presentation, so please do submit these in the Q&A option at the bottom of your screen at any point during the presentation, and I will then ask these on your behalf later on. Thank you very much for logging in, and I'll now hand over to Evan. Thank you, Evan.
Thank you, Ethne. Thank you, everyone, for joining and taking up some of your lunchtime to listen to me. As has just been explained, I've got an international background in conservation, and one of the things that I wanted to do when I began running Kent Wildlife Trust is really start to look at how we can use all of the tools in the box to achieve real impact conservation at scale. And one of those, which is clearly coming up on the agenda hugely for everyone, is how we can mesh the solutions to the climate crisis with solutions to the nature crisis. So Wilder Carbon is kind of born of that thinking, and I'm delighted to be talking to you about it this afternoon. And if I can get my screen working, here we go. So as I say, we've got two crises we're facing, nature and climate crisis. They're as critical as each other and they exacerbate one another. So we need to tackle them at the same time. And here is a screenshot from our website, which went live the other week. And you can all have a look at that later on if you so wish to get a bit more information on this. We basically are coming at this from the fact that we need to act now to make this solution come together. We don't have time to play with. We know that the clock is ticking in terms of beginning to actually reduce our overall carbon emissions, our impact on the planet in terms of biodiversity loss. And this is basically nature-based solutions. Wilder Carbon is one of those, is as we're coining it here, the real green recovery that we need. We need to be, instead of seeing those smoking peatlands from northern Britain, we need to be seeing functioning ecosystems all over the place at scale. So large-scale restoration of native habitat, we know, will assist with climate change and climate change mitigation and adaptation. The Lawton Review some years ago now made the case for the fact that we needed to have bigger, better and more joined up landscapes for biodiversity reasons. Exactly the same principles apply in terms of making our ecosystems more resilient for climate change. And we know that will result in greater biodiversity abundance and the subsequent benefits to people. So those would include, in this case, this is lowland fen restored in Kent, courtesy of beavers over the last 20 years, Ham Fen. And we know water quality has increased substantially, carbon has increased substantially, flood risk has decreased. This is the kind of system that we need to have much more broadly applied across the whole of the UK. And the question, therefore, is how do we pay for large-scale restoration of nature? So this brings us to what Wilder Carbon is. So Wilder Carbon is, as I say, a nature-based solution. It's based upon a habitat tool we've been developing over the last year, and I'll go into some more detail about said habitat tool in a sec. On the right there, you've got our bison project featured. One of the other aspects of this type of project is they need to really be low input, and they need to be restoring natural processes, and that kind of thing requires ecosystem engineers like beavers or in this case, bison, to be considered. Wilding approaches, if you like. So Wilder Carbon aims to become a benchmark for what we call carbon plus projects that address both nature and climate crises. So it's not just delivering carbon, it's delivering the biodiversity, those other co-benefits that I mentioned in some cases. There's also a bit of a void when it comes to habitat codes, which are emerging at the moment for multi-habitat schemes. Having a different code for every different habitat that we have in the UK will lead to a complexity that just won't work for investors. So the idea of Wilder Carbon is to be kind of an overarching mechanism that can deal with multiple habitats underneath one system. And that flexibility will mean that it can be applicable at all sorts of different scales as well. So as I'll come to later, we're doing some work to look at what it would mean on a national level, regional levels. We're looking at protected areas. We're starting to work with local authorities. And equally, we could apply this to farms, or we could apply it to an area around a new development where they're already considering net gain, but they could also be considering carbon benefits of offset land. It's a pilot. We've got a long way to go in fully developing this, and it's going to take us some time, but we're going to try and move at speed and maintain the momentum we've generated so far. And the way that we're going to work as a pilot is through what we're calling Pathfinder projects. So these are pilot projects. And there's one popping up on the screen at the moment, which is one in Kent again. It's effectively an extension of that concept you just saw, with the beavers restoring lowland fen from degraded arable farmland, which will run out of soil in the near future anyway, and emit carbon as it's doing so. It's reversing that, it's locking carbon back up and regenerating that habitat. At the moment, as a pilot, it won't deliver commercial returns. It's really important to stress that, but it will address the issue that there will be quantified returns in terms of the carbon and biodiversity net gain, because we have the tool to predict this. And the sort of crux of how we make it investable at this stage as a pilot is we use conservative minimum values for those anticipated carbon and biodiversity returns. And here again, you've got another Pathfinder project, which is the Somerset levels. And again, it gives you some idea of the sorts of areas concerned. And the costs in there, just for your awareness, are 50-year costs. So the idea of the scheme is that you secure an area and you also secure the funding to pay for the management required for the next 50 years, which locks up the carbon for that time and beyond, and therefore delivers what people are really looking for on this, which is permanence. So the Habitat tool is kind of the critical underpinning. Now, there was a report released in November, went a bit under the radar of many people because of its timing, I guess. It was done independent, nothing to do with us. It's actually done through the Green Finance Institute report, Financing UK Nature Recovery. And it represents a co-evolution of thought from a parallel sector, an extremely important part of this jigsaw. Basically saying that we need to work from the basis that we can't be delaying. We've got to use the existing methods and data available to us, and that's something we've looked at from the beginning. As I say, recognizing that we don't have the luxury of time. We can't wait for the perfect carbon data for every habitat in the UK. We'll be waiting for another 15 years, by which time we'll be 5 years out from when we need to be net zero. So we use the best available data in our Habitat tool, which has been pulled together for carbon storage, sequestration, soil and vegetation. It's terrestrially focused at the moment. We hope to move towards something that will work within the marine environment relatively soon. We're still working out how we can do that. But again, it goes to this point where we're trying to generate an estimate of the conservative minimum amount of carbon that could be locked up by making any given habitat wilder. So how would this work in practice? We're working at the moment with a range of wildlife trusts across the country. There's some of them just in that web capture again. So say one of those trusts, one of those trusted deliverers spots some marginal land. we want to know what the potential for locking up carbon through habitat restoration is going to be in that given area. We can use that database that I just mentioned in the habitat tool to work out what the current carbon value is in its degraded state. We can then model the change that we think will occur under conservation management, defining the endpoints that we want to get to in terms of creating better native habitats. And we can effectively look at the difference between the two to give us that marketable minimum estimated carbon value. And that's the key thing, it's got to be marketable. And that again is where there's a lot of additional complexity. I'm giving you the kind of the technical, almost biological bit of the puzzle. Another bit that we are working on throughout the rest of this year is very much working with the financial institutions to make the money then flow. But here's representation of a scheme which is in the Pathfinder Projects portfolio at the moment from Cumbria, and what they can see could be achieved if they go through this sort of process. And again, there's a carbon figure attached to this, and an estimate of cost, and that should make this into an investable pilot project. Obviously, wilder carbon coming from where it is has been originated within the wildlife trusts, and recognising the need for this carbon plus slew of projects which addresses both crises needs to take into account biodiversity as well. So version 2 of the habitat tool, which we're working on at the moment, will basically match that best available carbon data up with the DEFRA biodiversity net gain metric to allow us to come up with a score in terms of how much biodiversity uplift we think can be achieved in a given project, in a given area, depending on what habitat is being restored to. Going a bit more into sort of the mechanics of it, we've effectively recognised that what the UK lacks, for those of you who know a bit about sort of the carbon markets internationally, is a verified carbon standard for native habitat projects of this type. It doesn't really exist in this form globally, in fact, but we think there's a definite case, having talked to potential financiers and gauged their interest, for establishing a new standard, which, as I say, can act as an umbrella for various different habitat codes and schemes. Wilder carbon itself then aims to basically both fill that void and become an independent broker of those habitats, linking projects to the finance sector. And for this reason, we have just established Wilder Carbon as an independent company, so that we can both operate nationally, because obviously this has been originated in Kent Wildlife Trust, and this is a national scheme if we get it right. And also so that we can host an independent technical standards board. So as this matures, this technical standards board will be the group that then writes the carbon standard that we need. That standards board, which is being formed at the moment, is going to be a cross-sectoral group of independent experts from the various bits of the sort of broad sector around this, or sectors around it, that I'm mentioning up there. So including business and finance, as well as conservation and carbon experts, all at the table, all discussing this and collaborating to pull these standards together at speed, taking into account sort of learning from other standards and coming up with something which is cost effective and works for investors as well as for projects. At the moment, without those standards, we're working to set guiding principles. Falling out of those standards will be the monitoring, reporting and verification mechanisms. Any carbon scheme of this sort requires that you monitor, obviously, the amount of carbon which is actually being locked up against that which you've predicted, that there's transparent reporting, and that at given intervals, that amount of carbon is verified independently so it can be converted into carbon units, and then those can be sold. There are various different schemes into which it can be sold, and that's a whole other level of conversation I'm not going to go into today. Basically, it's a voluntary market and a compliance market, and the two may well be converging more. But at the moment, what we can do is make sure that the principles we're working to, the standards we're working to, are set at the right level to make sure that we're actually doing projects which are demonstrably seen to be both addressing both crises at once and also doing it in the best possible way. Now, the overall kind of international concerns about carbon projects, additional carbon projects, so this kind of, first of all, that they are really additional, they're new carbon that's been locked up. Secondly, as I've mentioned before, that it's been locked up permanently or for as long as possible. And then the third thing is that there's a reduced risk of leakage, which is basically that you don't push, for example, intensive agriculture from one area to another, which doesn't decrease your overall net impact. That third one's really difficult to deal with, and it'll be something we'll continue to look at. But effectively, by operating on marginal land, you're lowering the risk of doing that already. In addition to that, there is a set of principles we've looked at around biodiversity, carbon, obviously, and ethical investment. So another thing which has in the past been a problem with offsets, if you like, is the fact that people have regarded them as greenwashing. What we're looking at from the beginning with the standards that we're going to write is actually only working with companies that want to buy offsets against residual carbon emissions, where they have already reduced their emissions to the greatest extent possible. And we will be ideally working with those who have set net zero targets, and we can also have begun to apply measures to reduce their emissions. There is a need for nature-based solutions around long-term carbon removals, irrespective of all that as well. And Wilder Carbon, with high degree of permanence through working with NGOs like wildlife trusts that have a track record of holding land for long periods of time, will be a premium product in terms of being able to lock up carbon for those long periods of time and add to that overall removals picture, which is going to be really important for the UK. All of the pilot projects to start with are going to be focused on those trusted deliverers. It's the easiest group of projects that we can work with under the pilot. What we want to move towards is then working with third-party landowners. And the most likely mechanism to do that is the use of conservation covenants, which is something which is sewn into the Environment Bill whenever that goes through, and enabling a switch of land use to more carbon and biodiversity friendly management. So that's kind of a very quick overview of where we're going with standards based on the principles. The other piece of this is that as those pilot projects get up and going, the Pathfinder projects get up and going, then the groups who are working on them will basically form a community of practice, which will start to operate in terms of actually testing out cost-effective monitoring techniques for both carbon and biodiversity, and also it'll supply data back into the Habitat tool to make sure that that is continuously updated, and it will also enable the verification process for getting to carbon credits eventually. So as you can see, it's quite a complicated thing. It's going to be a lot of work over a number of years. As I say, kind of 5 years is probably the earliest we would be looking at actually generating any verified carbon credits from this. But it's really important that we work to a set of standards which assuage people's concerns around sort of enabling business to get away with continuing to emit. We want to get it right. The standards have got to be high, and it's got to work with multiple habitats. It's got to work across landscapes where we're dealing with, say, peatland on the top of the hill, moving down through transition to woodland in the bottom of the valley. A landowner is going to want to be kind of signed up to a single scheme to be able to do all of that. And increasingly investors are going to be looking to that kind of scale as well. The other piece to get us to that level of implementation is advocacy. Obviously, 2021, as we all know, is a hugely important year in terms of the kind of conservation politics, if you like. The UK is taking over G7. We've got the biodiversity COP, which has been moved back to October, but we're still anticipating is going ahead. And finally, we've got COP26 on climate. Obviously, a scheme like this plays into all of those things. There's biodiversity benefits, there's climate benefits. We are anticipating that if we're successful with this scheme, it will deliver at a scale that has a kind of national impact, and therefore there are a number of things that the government could do to help us to get this to scale, particularly when it is delivering against those international targets that we're all signed up to. So here you've got the Sustainable Development Goals as a for example there. So we're doing some modelling work at the moment to look at if there were X number of carbon plus projects delivered through Wilder Carbon per year at this sort of scale over the next 20 years, what would that mean for UK emissions? What would it do for the UK carbon budget? How would it play out with other things that are going to have to happen as well? And then that leads to a discussion with different bits of government, and we aim to profile some of the things that throws up at all of those events throughout the year, and working no doubt in the longer term off the back of some of that to make the case for nature-based solution more broadly. So as a summary schematic, I thought I'd throw this together. Hopefully it makes sense. As I've said, the whole scheme is predicated on the Habitat tool, which enables us to look at what the carbon and biodiversity potential for a given area is if it's restored. That enables us to put together these sequestration models, how much carbon could be locked up in a given site, which may be a small site, or it may be regional, or it may be national, obviously with different degrees of accuracy around it, and that will be finessed over time as we get better at doing this and as the data becomes better. That both feeds into and is improved by the data that we get from Pathfinder projects. We're already, as I've explained, working with a series of trusted deliverers, which are Wildlife Trusts to start with, other ENGOs we anticipate coming on in due course. We're starting to work with local authorities, looking at how they could use their own land to be part of this jigsaw of improving the carbon sequestration account, if you like. And there's the range of other stakeholders that we anticipate working with within the next 12 months. So private landowners, private companies such as utilities, and hopefully protected areas as well, which have enormous potential. And the other thing, as I've mentioned, is we'd hope to move from terrestrial to working in the marine ecosystems as well, which have enormous potential for locking up huge amounts of carbon if restored. And those Pathfinder projects then start to leverage private capital, and after hopefully a successful pilot, that then starts to open the doors to full-scale investment based upon a greater degree of return. All of that feeds through into our political advocacy work, based particularly off that modelling. And if we succeed, then the overall impact is a major contribution to the restoration of 30% of UK landscapes for carbon and nature as per the government's current commitments, in a way that just hasn't been possible to date. So I hope I've made the case for the fact that this could be quite exciting, it's quite important, and yeah, we're looking forward to really getting our teeth into delivering those Pathfinder projects, getting the standards out of the door, and getting investment in some of those Pathfinder projects throughout the pilot over the next year. That is it from me. I look forward to some questions, hopefully.
Thank you, Evan. That was really interesting, and really interesting to hear about a tool that's trying to bring together some of the key concepts that we're talking about: ecosystem restoration, biodiversity net gain, and carbon sequestration. So thank you, that was really interesting. Just a quick question from me. One thing you mentioned was that the tool at the moment is based on the best available data for carbon, and that obviously this will be improved upon as more monitoring happens for some of the projects. What is the kind of coverage like for different types of ecosystems in the UK in terms of this carbon data?
Pretty good. I mean, there are 4 habitats where we know the quality of data is so top quality. The others, there are varying degrees of quality of data. So one of the reasons we're going for that minimum estimation is so we can work with what we've got as we finesse it. But there is carbon sequestration data and carbon storage data for most habitats that we'll be working with. So the big ones, of course, are woodland, where there's very good data, at least in the vegetative side of things, although a lot of the current models don't really take full account of the soil carbon side of things. We've got peatland, where there is great data for small areas of peatland, but a lot of it would actually still kind of fit into kind of medium grade. But we know, again, there's huge potential. And then you've got things like salt marsh as well, where again there's quite a lot of variability, but there's a high enough degree of certainty that we can start to run some schemes over there. The others are much more sketchy, but again, if we work with the lowest values and don't overpromise, if that generates enough financing to actually do the restoration work on those habitats, to an extent, it doesn't matter, because what this is about is having that impact rather than maximizing finance. And so we are coming at this from the perspective of, we want to restore the habitat. If it gives us enough money to do that, then let's get on with it.
Great, thank you. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, using the smallest figures, as you've suggested, is a good way forward. So we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'll get started with some of the attendee questions. Can you comment on how this will link to existing farming-led carbon accounting tools, such as the Farm Carbon Toolkit and the Cool Farm tool?
It's a conversation we need to pick up more with the people who are behind those particular tools. I mean, if in effect, at the moment, a lot of those tools are looking at kind of the existing carbon account for a given farm. And this is looking at the potential for, if you took a farm and you took a number of actions on it, what would be the additional carbon benefit? And then also looking at how you could roll that into, as I say, things like conservation covenants and actually make it work from a financing perspective. So we're having conversations with people all over the place, and we are actually looking for another conversation with those people as we speak. It's not fully joined up yet. It's going to take us ages to get all of this joined up. I mean, we're having conversations all over the place with many different stakeholders, and it's a very complicated puzzle. What we want to try and do is kind of be the glue to pull it all together. We don't anticipate doing everything, and we also don't anticipate that we will be the only solution. And there is clearly enough for multiple different tools to be applied in slightly different ways, and they're all required and probably all as valid as each other as well.
Great, thank you. A question here about ecosystem services. So all ecosystem services are delivered as integrated co-benefits or disbenefits if there are negative trade-offs. How are you screening for total impact across the full spectrum of ecosystem services, whether traded or not, and therefore avoiding unintended negative externalities?
I think the answer to that is we can only do as much as we can. I mean, there's no perfect system there, and we've all seen that many past schemes basically haven't worked because they haven't taken into account all of the potential benefits or the actual benefits that are delivered, which haven't been valued. So, what we're trying to do is just do something which is as good as possible, recognizing that we're going to have to continue to improve it over time. So when the V1 of the standards is published, it will be a version for it as a starting point. It will then have to be improved as all of these things are. What we don't want to do is come up with something which just doesn't achieve the impact we need. We need to be impact focused. If we look at what's happened on the international side of things with something like REDD, for those of you who know about that, which is something I looked at sort of 20 years ago when I was working on the international side of things. I worked on the front line of the arc of deforestation, as they call it in Brazil, with local farmers who are cutting down the forest. The reason they were cutting down the forest was because they weren't receiving any payment to keep it standing, if you want to put it crudely. They had to have a way to feed their families. The reason they weren't receiving any payment was because of the international accounting procedures which had been put in place for quite laudable reasons. But as a result, we weren't having the impact that we needed to have. So we want to work this back the other way, work it from how do we achieve the impact, work out the system, minimize any disbenefits that we can see, be mindful of the fact that we won't catch them all initially, very unlikely we'll get it perfect, and then keep on finessing it and improving it as we go.
Great, thank you. And another question here is whether we could apply this type of solution into our farming system, for example, by encouraging and supporting farmers to transition from monocrops to intercrops, wildlife borders, etc. Do you think this tool could also be used in that context?
Again, I mean, working with some of the other tools that are out there, I absolutely do. I think the challenge is going to be, I mean, there are kind of cultural challenges there as well. So there's technically, yes, we can work out a way to do that. And we are starting to talk to reps at the NFU, for example, about how this could work alongside NELMS when it comes in. One of the things with NELMS is it's actually not going to come into play probably until the end of the decade, and that's a bit too late as far as I'm concerned. So there's multiple reasons that we want to get this up and running sooner, but there is no reason in my mind why you couldn't have the two working in tandem and effectively something, and being simplistic in reductions and realizing this isn't going to how it looks eventually, but have NELMS basically pay for the good features of a farm from a carbon and biodiversity perspective, which already exist, and have something like Wilder Carbon paying for the additional stuff, because it's got to be new, it's got to be additional, via private finance, to do even more on that same farm to lock up more new carbon and create better biodiversity habitats. So yes, it's all there for the taking, but it's not going to be simple.
Definitely, yes. And going back to the model, does the model take into account the likely effects of climate change over the next 50 years upon the ecological habitats in question, and how this will affect restoration measures?
To the extent that we think that all of the literature is beginning to point to the fact that if you restore natural processes, you have greater resilience. So the more biodiverse your system and the more natural process driven it is, and the better it's going to be at adapting and the more resilient it's going to be to climate change. So that is why we're absolutely not going for simplistic tree planting, and nor are we going to go in for kind of species selection and really kind of defined endpoints. A lot of this is going to be monitoring the biodiversity that arises through natural regeneration, and putting in things like your ecosystem engineer species to then do the management for you. I mean, effectively, it's the application of wilding at different scales, recognizing that's going to be very context specific. But that's the only way really that we're going to be able to allow nature to adapt, is for it to happen. And then to keep monitoring and see what it does to biodiversity and the carbon levels.
Great, thank you. And how will you work to have your verified carbon standard chosen over others that might be developed? And do you think there will be a market for verified carbon standards to develop?
Yeah, I mean, some of that's just going to depend on what else arises. Sorry, unable to speak there. We can't control that. That's going to become a market mechanism to an extent. But what we can do at the moment is we can say that we have talked to a lot of people, and we think we're in a good position to, as I say, become a bit of a coordinator for some of these conversations. We don't want to be the only game in town. We're not going to be. We need to have multiple different tools that are available to people in different contexts, so they can do what is right for them to be part of solving both the nature and climate crises. I do think there's a huge role for the sort of approach we're advocating here. And we have talked to large scale investors who are very interested. They're looking for a few signals from government and others to make the jump. And they're very interested in this standard. So once the standard is up and running, then I think, and as long as we've got a good pipeline of projects, and to be honest, the limiter for this type of project in the past has always been the finance, then it will work. To what degree will it work, and how much will it contribute to that kind of overall national picture? Some of that is completely out of our hands, and some of it's going to go down to kind of political strategies way beyond kind of the stuff that we're talking about. But it's got to be a huge amount. We've got to have a huge amount of restoration of multiple habitats. Otherwise, as I said at the beginning, we may solve a climate crisis and then kind of get shot in the foot by the biodiversity crisis. So yeah, we need it somewhere.
Yep, thank you. And what are your thoughts on how developers marry up the need for biodiversity net gain through ecologically diverse habitats and then selecting habitats that have high carbon uptake but might not be the most biodiverse?
Again, I think it's very context specific, and it's going to be company specific as well, because it's going to be to do with their kind of values that they're driven by, and a whole other set of factors. But I think what we need to do is argue for the fact that, as we've been saying, there are multiple reasons why you might want to consider having a more biodiverse bit of land attached to your development, if you like. Even if you're looking at a 30-year net gain contract, if you like, then in that period of time, there might be quite a lot of climate change coming your way. And if you don't want to waste your money, then actually having a better mix of habitats that adds to the resilience of what you've done is probably a reasonable argument anyway. And we're definitely not seeing developers we're talking to so far, we're not seeing them pushing for particularly high carbon value habitats, by which I guess you're talking about tree planting, over what they would do from a net gain perspective anyway, and actually marrying the two together and saying, that actually it's the other way around. In most cases for developers, they've got to achieve at the moment, after all, legally, we hope soon, when the environment bill goes through, they're going to have to achieve, their net gain first, and then the carbon value is almost like a secondary additional that they could look at. So it's probably the other way around for a lot of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. And do you think we could apply this type of solution into large-scale development master planning? For example, where urban extension is proposed or new towns are proposed, could these tools be used in assisting in ensuring that we have the best gain or benefit from the associated green spaces in the urban planning?
Definitely. I mean, it's a simple answer, and we are starting to look at that kind of level of monitoring with local economic partnerships, for example. So there are multiple levels at which this thinking can be applied, and we are looking for that sweet spot, I think, on a number of levels. It will be variable how it kind of pans out. I mean, I know one of the trusts that we're working with is looking at working with a large unitary authority as well on this stuff. I mean, the thinking is coming, and it's coming at that sort of level. So yes, is the answer.
Great. And you mentioned there kind of working with other wildlife trusts. With your work, when you're working together with them, have you been thinking about ways of connecting up their different owned sites as part of the ecological restoration rewilding? Because I know that sometimes they can work quite isolated from one another.
Yeah, I mean, that goes to this community of practice thing, and hopefully that'll eventually go beyond just the wildlife trusts we're working with, and also I anticipate sort of more trusts will sign up over time. Remember, we're all kind of independently governed, so we have to go through our own process before we sign up to any scheme like this. But yeah, the drivers are common to everyone, and everyone realizes we need something of this kind. The devil's always in the detail.
Definitely. And based on your initial calculations for the model, in terms of affordability, does it feel like you're in the right ballpark area? For example, do you feel like the cost of carbon is matched to the cost of habitat creation? Or do you think the cost of carbon is going to need to change significantly to make this more balanced?
Yeah, it's a really good question. At the moment, it's the price of carbon on the voluntary market is far too low. And I think a number of people have been saying that recently. However, a lot of people that we're talking to are already costing it in as much higher. And on the European trading scheme last year, I think it's 3 months running, it hit an all-time high. If you kind of get the overall cost of a scheme and divide it up by hectare and then by year, as it were, and we come up with a kind of a per unit cost, we're looking at about £45 as the kind of lower end. So it's higher, but we're already encountering developers who are putting in at £100, and that would enable us to actually buy sites and then manage them for 50 years. And some of them are already considering that, particularly because they want kind of premium UK product. They don't want to, many potential buyers want to have the option of, buying credits in the UK at sites that they can actually physically go and visit, that they can match to their customer base, that they can market off the back of the species, which will come back. They don't want to just sort of buy credits in Indonesia, where it's going to be really difficult to see what happens to them, where the legal system, may or may not work in favour of actually kind of safeguarding that habitat. People want to see something real and high quality done in the UK, and I think they'll pay more for it. And they will have to, obviously, because land prices here and management costs here are significantly higher.
That makes a lot of sense. And can the tool be used with ecological restoration, which is more transient in its goals? For example, a rewilding project, which is nature-led and does not have as clearly defined goals in terms of carbon.
Yes, I think it can. I mean, it's just going to be applied slightly differently, but one of our targets is actually to make it work for rewilding projects. And if there are people out there, who'd like to sort of work with us on setting up some Pathfinder projects based upon that kind of more open-ended approach, then we'd be delighted to talk to you as well.
Great. I think this is going to have to be the last question. Thanks to everyone for putting so many in. It's great to have so much engagement with attendees. So when do you think that modelling work and monitoring work will be able to feed back into the tool so that we can get some idea of how this type of project can actually help UK emissions reductions?
So the modelling work, I mean, it'll be done initially, obviously, is very high level, and we're actually planning to get that out of the door within the next couple of months, let's say, to kind of link to advocacy around the two conferences of the parties this year. We will then, some of the Pathfinder projects are actually already starting to ramp up to do carbon and biodiversity monitoring on the ground as we speak. That will then become a continuous feedback loop, and we need to have that coming back in, as I say, before we can get verification on the amount of carbon that's been locked up. So within 5 years, I hope we'd have a reasonable feedback loop.
Great. Well, thank you once again, Evan. That was really interesting, and we'd be keen to hear more about the project as you continue on with it. Thank you for all our attendees as well, and for all the questions. I'm really sorry if I didn't make it to yours, but really appreciate you being here. I hope you found this beneficial and useful and informative. Don't forget to record your attendance on the IES CPD tool. This webinar has been recorded and will be made available on the IES website and YouTube channel. And just to let you know that the next IES webinar in the series Exploring Nature-Based Solutions will be on the 28th of April, and we'll be looking at the role of nature-based solutions in a just transition. Again, this is free to attend, so please do visit the IES website to register. Thank you once again, Evan, and thank you to everyone that attended. See you next time.